In light of the latest geopolitical events taking place in the world and what may happen in the very near future, in connection with the rise to power in the United States of Donald Trump, I have decided to bring to the attention of all interested parties the secret information that I have from the direct participants and executors of this top-secret operation of the KGB of the USSR to recruit and subsequently cooperate with US citizen Donald John Trump. The leaders and high-ranking officers of the KGB of the USSR, as well as the State Security Service of Czechoslovakia, Statny Bezpečnost, were involved in this operation. I do not exclude the possibility of participation and supervision by state bodies of the USSR and the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. The head of the KGB of the USSR, Yuri Andropov, and his first deputy Semyon Tsvigan were the direct leaders of this secret operation. Army General Tsvigan also supervised the 2nd, 3rd, and 5th Directorates of the KGB of the USSR and the main Directorate of the Border Troops of the KGB of the USSR. The leadership and staff of the 2nd Directorate of Counterintelligence of the KGB of the USSR directly carried out contact recruitment of Donald John Trump during his first trip to the USSR in 1987. But this recruitment operation, according to the data I have verified, began back in the mid-70s with the direct participation of the leadership of the 1st Main Directorate of the KGB of the USSR, Intelligence, and the State Security Service of Czechoslovakia. In order for interested parties to understand the extent of my access to classified information and sources, and to trust my information, I would like to slightly lift the curtain on my identity. I am a former Lieutenant Colonel of the 5th Directorate of the GRU of the USSR, the Directorate of Operational Intelligence. Due to close family ties and complete trust, from February 5, 1982 to July 13, 1987, I was the closest assistant to the Chief of the Main Intelligence Directorate, Deputy Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the USSR, Army General Pyotr Ivashutin, and due to the nature of my service, I had access to the most secret information of all intelligence and special services of the USSR, as well as the security services of the Warsaw Pact countries. I had to directly communicate with the leadership of the intelligence services of these countries and, on Ivashutin's instructions, delve into and supervise joint operations. At that time, not a single, even the most insignificant operation carried out on the territory of Eastern European countries or on the territory of the rest of the world was possible without the participation of Soviet specialists. All operations involving the special services of these socialist countries were carried out only after coordination with Moscow. The ears and the watchful eye of the big brother of the occupier were sticking out everywhere. And I very often had to be precisely these ears and eyes of Pyotr Ivashutin. I will start with information I received quite recently from a former high-ranking officer of the State Security Service of Czechoslovakia. After the collapse of the USSR and the socialist camp, and after the declaration of independence of the Czech Republic and Slovakia, he became a general of the Office of Foreign Relations and Information, i.e. the Foreign Intelligence of the Czech Republic. Starting his service in Statny Bezpečnost, he was directly subordinate to Colonel G. Kudelka, who in the late 60s recruited and subsequently supervised Ivana Marie Zelnkov, the future first wife of Donald John Trump. She was recruited in the highest category in the qualification of secret agent. Such people were recruited for conscious cooperation. Reasons: material benefits, coupons in department stores, financing of expenses, clothing, Western alcohol, etc., better employment options with opportunities to travel around the world. And also, ideological reasons, the fight for socialism, the peace movement, etc. An important addition was communication with representatives of the unfriendly West. It resulted in psychological pressure on the subjects through compromising information, demoralization of the individual, blackmail, etc. Statny Bezpečnost used undercover agents in all its departments: intelligence, counterintelligence, security, surveillance, and the intelligence technical department. In intelligence, there were such categories of undercover agents as agent, secret liaison, and ideological collaborator. Cooperation was most often terminated due to the health or death of the employee, his emigration, demotion, etc., but everything depended on the quality of the cooperation. Ivana Marie Zelnkov was born on February 20, 1949, in the city of Gottwald in Moravia. From her youth, she devoted her attention to alpine skiing. According to Ivana herself, she was even a member of the reserve team of Czechoslovakia at the 1972 Winter Olympics. But if this pre-prepared legend worked until the mid-80s, then already in 1989, by the time of the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and its secret intelligence services, the Secretary General of the Olympic Committee of Czechoslovakia Petr Pomezny began to refute this legend. When journalists asked about Ivana Zelnkov, he replied, "Who is this woman Ivana, and why do journalists continue to ask about her? We have searched and consulted with many people many times, and there is no such girl in our records." It is this remark that makes us look into her biography in more detail. We see a standard scheme used by the special services of the USSR and the Warsaw Pact countries to transfer and legalize their female agents to the countries of the hostile West. This is a fictitious marriage with a foreigner who fell into the networks of these special services due to some offense. From my experience of service in the GRU of the USSR, I claim that we had quite extensive lists of such potential clients for subsequent recruitment in order to later use them in our interests. Zelnkov's example is very typical of the classic pattern of this kind of operation. In 1971, Zelnkov married Austrian ski instructor Alfred Wilkelmeyer. In March 1972, Ivana Wilkelmeyer received Austrian citizenship. The fact that this was a fictitious marriage is evidenced by the fact that from the moment of the wedding and while living with Alfred, Ivana Wilkelmeyer had a romantic relationship with the Czechoslovak lyricist and playwright Jiří Tidal, who was also an employee of the State Security Service of Czechoslovakia. He helped Ivana quickly adapt to her new role. Tidal died in a car accident in 1973, and most likely not by accident. At least, according to my Czech informant, the police closed this case very quickly. After Tidal's death in 1973, Ivana and her fictitious husband left for the United States, where they got divorced in Los Angeles. After the divorce, Ivana moved to Canada, where she lived with another employee of the Czechoslovak State Security Service, George Yuri Sirovatka, who was acting undercover. According to the legend, he was the owner of a ski boutique in Montreal. Ivana had known this employee since his studies and service in Czechoslovakia since 1967. While living in Canada, Ivana worked as a ski instructor and worked part-time as a model in a department store and a designer clothing store. She was also involved in the advertising campaign for the 1976 Summer Olympics. There was a strong hand behind her, skillfully leading her to the main goal of her entire life and service. With a beautiful biography and an impressive portfolio. In 1976, Ivana was introduced to Donald John Trump by the KGB residency in the USA. She immediately broke up with Yuri Sirovatka and threw herself into Trump's arms. That was when the operation to recruit and use Donald Trump in the KGB operations began. And it was Ivana Zelnkov who prepared Trump and brought him to Moscow in 1987 to ensure personal contact between her husband and the then chairman of the KGB. According to my information, this meeting took place in one of the KGB buildings in Kaiselny Lane. Ivana Zelnkov, in addition to her native Czech, was fluent in several languages: Russian, German and French. She herself did not indicate English among these languages, although she lived in the USA with Trump from 1976 to 1992. In her marriage with Donald Trump, she had 3 children: Donald Trump Jr., Ivanka Trump and Eric Trump. How did she communicate with her husband and children without knowing English? The fact that she did not indicate fluency in English could be a kind of psychological defense. And this is one of the skills that are taught in the secret services. The moment when Donald Trump's family relationship with Ivana Trump Zelnkov began to break up miraculously coincided with the time of the destruction of the socialist system, the Warsaw Pact and the secret services of the former socialist bloc countries in 1989. By the way, their official divorce took place in the same month, March 1992, when the KGB of the USSR and the GRU of the USSR ceased to exist. This was a clear attempt by Donald Trump to get rid of the documentary connection with the agent of the State Security Service of Czechoslovakia and the trail of its Moscow leadership. But the KGB of the USSR turned out to have 2 long tentacles. In conclusion of the research into Ivana Zelnkov's personality, I would like to inform you that in 2022, by decree of the President of the Czech Republic, she was posthumously awarded the Gold Medal for merit on the recommendation of the leadership of the Czech Security Service. This award is given by the President of the Czech Republic to citizens for merits in public service or local government, for achievements in the field of economics, science, technology, culture, art, sports, education, defense and national security of the state. But how the recruitment operation itself took place and what could have been discussed at the meeting between the chairman of the KGB of the USSR, Comrade Chebrikov, and Mr. Trump, I will tell you in my next message. Before approving the scheme for recruiting Donald Trump, experts compiled his psychological profile. This is the rule: the psychological features of the subject are identified, and a determination is made, are there prerequisites and grounds for his recruitment. But let's first delve into the history of the creation and construction of the Bolshevik punitive intelligence and counterintelligence system itself. I often come across various scientific works by Western researchers who call themselves specialists in the history of the USSR and experts in the work of the Soviet special services, starting from the moment of the October Revolution and until the collapse of the USSR in 1991. But all these specialists are historians or journalists at best by their education, that is, people far from the special services, from their ideology and the way of thinking of the employees of the Soviet, and now Russian special services. This mentality is formed during study in special institutions and subsequent service, and does not coincide with the generally accepted principles of morality in the West. A normal and mentally healthy person simply will not understand this. Having lived in Europe for over 10 years and periodically communicating with employees of European special services, I came to the conclusion that foreign citizens do not understand and are initially incapable of perceiving the ideological basis embedded in the consciousness of employees of the Soviet special services. It is precisely this misunderstanding and work according to their European moral and ethical templates that does not allow them to effectively counter the active measures of the Soviet, and now Russian, special services. I didn't just go through all the stages of training in the field of counterintelligence and intelligence of the USSR. I graduated from the higher school of the KGB and served for almost 2 years in the first main directorate, PGU KGB USSR, then for more than 10 years was close to the leadership of the GRU USSR, directly participating in the creation and construction of ideological principles and templates of the work of the system itself. Unlike most of my colleagues, who did not have high-ranking fathers with big shoulder straps, I was inside this think tank from childhood and witnessed the discussion of service problems and situations by grown-up uncles in shoulder straps in an informal setting during family get-togethers at the dacha. I saw tipsy marshals and generals, heard them and learned the nature of the system itself from the drunken revelations of military leaders. Such feasts were frequent and took place at generals' dachas in the near Moscow region. Of course, by the time I entered and began studying at the KGB higher school, I was several heads above all my classmates and future colleagues in understanding how the system works. Later, already a major in the USSR GRU, for future career growth, I externally graduated from the Military Diplomatic Academy, at the insistence of the head of the GRU, Pyotr Ivashutin. And since then, I have had quite extensive connections. After all, some of my classmates from the day before yesterday now work in the central office of the FSB of Russia and in the main directorate of the General Staff of the Ministry of Defense. 2 days ago, from one of my former classmates, a general in the central office of the FSB, I received more detailed and precise information about the operation to recruit the future US President Donald John Trump by the KGB of the USSR. According to information from my former classmate, who, due to the nature of his service, has access to the most secret archives of the FSB, SVR, and old KGB documents, active measures with Donald Trump began in 1978. On October 17, 1978, the first deputy chief of the first main directorate of the KGB of the USSR, Lieutenant General Boris Ivanov, reported at a meeting of the heads of the first main directorate and, in particular, the chief of the first main directorate of the KGB of the USSR, Vladimir Kryachkov, on the completion of the first preliminary stage of recruiting Donald Trump, and proposed moving on to real cooperation and using him in active measures in the United States and other Western countries. Ivanov Boris Semenovich supervised Directorate K, Counterintelligence, and departments for the Western Hemisphere. In 1955 to 1959, he headed the legal KGB residency in New York. In 1960 to 1962, he was the head of the first department of the first main directorate of the KGB. From January 1962 to June 1964, he was a legal KGB resident in the United States, in New York, and went on business trips to Chile, Peru, Argentina, and Cuba. During his missions in the United States, he held the post of advisor to the permanent representative of the USSR to the UN, was an individual member of the Commission on Human Rights and the Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities of the UN. From March 17, 1979, he became the head of the KGB operational group in Afghanistan. From 1982 to 1987, he was the chief intelligence consultant of the group of consultants to the chairman of the KGB. Now we can assume with 100% certainty that it was Boris Ivanov who directly reported to Andropov and later to Chebrikov about cooperation with Donald Trump. It should be noted that it was Ivanov who in the 1980s was the representative of the KGB of the USSR in the Small Five of the Politburo, an expert foreign policy body that determined the foreign policy of the USSR. He was also the official representative of the USSR in international negotiations on security and cooperation in Europe and the limitation of strategic nuclear weapons. By the way, during the invasion of the USSR troops into Czechoslovakia in 1968, Ivanov was the deputy head of the KGB operational group in Czechoslovakia and practically supervised and directed the joint actions of the USSR KGB and the local Statny Bezbednost service. From that moment on, it was Ivanov who supervised and maintained friendly, trusting ties with the STB leadership. And remembering the primary role of the Czechoslovak special services in this operation, we can easily identify the figure who played the main role in the recruitment of Donald Trump. I have listed Ivanov's positions in such detail to show what great importance the leadership of the USSR KGB and the country's leadership attached to the recruitment of Donald Trump even before the collapse of the USSR. Perhaps the collapse of the USSR was a psychological blow for Trump himself, which ideologically and mentally brings him closer to Putin. After Lieutenant General Ivanov was transferred to a higher management level in 1978, Major General Yuri Ivanovich Drozdov, Deputy Chief of the First Main Directorate of the KGB of the USSR, Chief of Directorate S of Illegal Intelligence of the First Main Directorate of the KGB of the USSR, who held this position from 1979 to 1991. Took on the figure of Donald Trump in the system of the First Main Directorate of the KGB of the USSR. At the same time, at the end of 1979, the Top Secret Service A, Active Measures, was connected to this operation. The employees of this secret service carried out open or secret specific operations, E measures, the purpose of which was to influence certain areas of the political life of countries, their foreign policy, the solution of international problems, to mislead the enemy, undermine and weaken his positions, disrupt his plans, etc. One of the goals of active measures is to influence public opinion in other countries, as well as the actions of individuals, state and public organizations. In the Soviet Union, it was precisely these activities that were carried out by Service A of the First Main Directorate of the KGB, which worked in close contact with the International Department of the Central Committee of the CPSU. Since that moment, Donald Trump has received comprehensive support from highly qualified specialists in the areas that are now being carried out before our eyes both in the United States and in the Western world. Most likely, relying on the rich experience of the employees of this secret service and long-standing contact with it, Donald Trump and his entourage created the mega movement to conduct election campaigns in 2016 and 2024, staging assassination attempts and much more with the set of shock content that the whole world has seen in recent months. I understand why Western intelligence agencies could not find an antidote to these active actions, thoroughly developed and carried out by highly professional specialists of this secret service. But let's return to Trump's curators. Leaving for a new position, Lieutenant General Ivanov transferred supervision and all management of this operation to his deputy, Major General Vadim Alexievich Kirpichenko, who later received the rank of Lieutenant General. From 1970 to 1974, Kirpichenko was a resident in Tunisia and Egypt. Then for 5 years, until August 1979, he headed the Illegal Intelligence Department S of the First Main Directorate of the KGB of the USSR. He worked with Helen and Peter Kroger, Leontina and Morris Cohen. He led the storming of Armene's palace in 1979. From 1979 to 1991, Kirpichenko was the first deputy head of the First Main Directorate of the KGB of the USSR. After Kryachkov was promoted in 1988, Gorbachev demanded that young people be promoted, and 65-year-old Kirpichenko's career growth was cut short. Nevertheless, he continued to serve under Yeltsin, and resigned only in 1997. It should be noted that it was he who headed Directorate S for 5 years, which in 1979 took Donald Trump under its wing and began to help him in active measures. He continued to supervise this operation and secretly manage active measures already in the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation. One of Trump's curators was Lazar Lazarevich Matviev, a legendary figure. He was the head of the Soviet intelligence group in East Germany, represented the USSR in the Ministry of State Security of the GDR. From 1982 to 1989, he held the post of KGB USSR liaison officer for the Dresden district, and in 1982 to 83 was directly subordinate to Viktor Nagayev, the former head of the illegal group of the S Directorate of the KGB of the USSR. And just for information, Lazar Matviev was Vladimir Putin's immediate superior during the Dresden period. In this message, I focused on the moment of the preparatory part of the recruitment and the beginning of active measures to work with Donald Trump. I also identified the interested parties and high-ranking officers involved in the development of the subject. All of them, one might say, are legends of the first main directorate of the KGB of the USSR. Can you imagine how important this operation was for the KGB and the leadership of the USSR, since they, together with the State Security Service of Czechoslovakia, threw their best personnel into its implementation? In my next message, I will talk about the tasks that were assigned to Donald Trump by the leaders of the KGB of the USSR, and also publicized the very active events in which Donald Trump personally took part. For me, as a specialist in Soviet intelligence and counterintelligence, accustomed to working according to systemic templates, it is clear why he was chosen. Trump initially perfectly matched all our criteria. From early childhood, he showed signs of criminal consciousness. With a complete lack of generally accepted moral principles and spiritual values, Trump was absolutely unprincipled and full of contempt for the sense of civic duty. It was precisely such specimens that were systematically sought out and subsequently recruited by the KGB, GRU, and the security services of the Warsaw Pact countries. To the question, what could interest young Donald Trump? I will try to answer briefly. The Bolshevik regime declared its main strategic goal to be the triumph of Red Terror throughout the world, which would be the key to the victory of the World Revolution. This was the main idea of the criminal Bolshevik convicts who created a barbaric ideology under the guise of beautiful populist slogans. All over the world they sought out marginal and unprincipled individuals who were ready to cooperate with the GPU, NKVD, KGB, and now the FSB, despite their own acts of treason. Among historical figures, these include Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, Palmiro Togliatti and Ernst Thälmann, Dolores Ibárruri and Mao Zedong, Kim Il-sung, and many others who succumbed to the ideological handouts of the Bolsheviks under the mythological source of world revolution. All of them became traitors to their countries and their peoples. Donald Trump can be included in this list of traitors and moral freaks. In the fight to promote their ideology, the USSR special services used any dirty methods, political terror and murder, prostitution, drug production and distribution, human trafficking. The creation and support of terrorist organizations like the Palestine Liberation Front, the IRA in Ireland, ETA, and the Red Brigades in Spain are all bloody creations of the USSR. Having created a terrorist state under the leadership of yesterday's convicts, the Bolsheviks merged with the criminal underworld, establishing the Red Comintern and, having created a state system, after which they began to pursue a policy based on the creation and support of terrorist movements throughout the world. This support required colossal financial resources, and this budget was formed from the sale of weapons, the production and sale of drugs, human trafficking, prostitution, and the gambling business. With the rise to power of the pro-Soviet Castro regime in Cuba, the USSR began to actively interfere in the affairs of Latin American countries. Career officers of the KGB and GRU began to supervise and, together with the security services of Cuba, established direct contacts with the drug cartels of Mexico, Colombia, and a number of other countries. The goal was to, if not destroy, then undermine stability within the United States through the delivery and distribution of drugs. During my service in the GRU, I often came across reports on operations and active measures carried out jointly with Cuban comrades. In the structure of the GRU, this area was handled by the Third Directorate, focused on the countries of the Western Hemisphere, Great Britain and its dominions. During my service, This directorate was headed in turn by Petriashev Kelsey Fedorovic and Sokolkin Ivan Pavlovich. It was these high-ranking officers who organized and supervised the implementation of joint operations with Cuban special services on the territory of the United States and Latin American countries. They supervised work with drug cartels that produced drugs and distributed them, primarily in the United States. On the Cuban side, Manuel Pineo Losada, a Cuban state security officer, politician, and statesman, founder of the Castro government special services, personally participated in such operations. He was an active participant in the Cuban Revolution and a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Cuba, and headed the American department of the Central Committee of the CPC. He organized political repressions and secret special operations. But Pineo's main area of activity was foreign intelligence, exporting the revolution and Cuban expansion in Latin America. The apparatus created under his leadership was considered one of the most successful security and intelligence agencies in the world, and was compared to the East German Stasi service. Pineo's main operational partner was Marcus Wolf. I note that the CIA considered Pineo to be the Cuban equivalent of Wolf. Pineo oversaw secret operations and support for pro-communist forces in Argentina, Venezuela, Peru, Colombia, and Bolivia. It was from these Latin American countries that cocaine flowed in an inexhaustible stream with the direct participation of Manuel Pineo. In 1974, Pineo became the head of the American department of the Central Committee of the CPC. In this capacity, he continued to oversee Cuban operations in Latin America, organized support for leftist, Marxist and pro-communist movements, Grenadian, Nicaraguan, Salvadoran, Guatemalan. He was in charge of intelligence and political activities in the United States, disintegration actions in Cuban political emigrant organizations. Among Pineo's contacts were such major figures as Peruvian President Velasco Alvarado, Panamanian leader Omar Torrijos, and the rise to power of the governments of Maurice Bishop and especially Daniel Ortega were considered brilliant achievements of Pineo. Why did I pay such special attention to this topic in my post about Trump? Because the purpose of recruiting Donald Trump is inextricably linked to the production and distribution of drugs in the United States and other countries of the Western Hemisphere. The profits from the production and distribution of drugs had to be legalized. Until the mid-70s, this was relatively easy. After all, international control over financial transactions had not yet been established, and the profits received from criminal activity were easily legalized by the Soviet special services and their Cuban colleagues, after which they were directed to support terrorist revolutionary organizations and movements in Western countries. But in the late 70s, laundering became problematic, the risks increased, and it was necessary to look for a legal or at least semi-legal way to launder money received from criminal business. According to my information received from my superior, the head of the USSR GRU, Army General Pyotr Ivashutin, and the head of the 5th Directorate of Operational Intelligence, Lieutenant General Konstantin Tkachenko, our special services were intensively searching for owners of companies associated with the construction and gambling businesses, with large trading companies with chain stores. They were also looking in other areas. They were interested in firms and companies capable of officially passing huge amounts of cash through their structures. These searches were carried out in the USA by employees of the 1st Department of the KGB 1st Chief Directorate. However, according to my superiors, our employees failed to find and recruit such owners of large businesses in the USA. But the 1st Chief Directorate, together with the State Security Service of Czechoslovakia, was more fortunate in this direction. They managed to recruit and involve American businessman Donald Trump in their active activities. Now it is time to move on to a more detailed examination of the participation of Agent Trump in the active activities of the 1st Chief Directorate. If we analyze the financial ups and downs of his companies, then starting from 1976, from the moment of the beginning of recruitment, these periods will surprisingly coincide with the successes and failures of the Bolshevik system itself. Until 1987, that is, until the moment of Trump's arrival in Moscow and personal meeting with the chairman of the KGB of the USSR Viktor Chebrikov, the financial income of Donald Trump's companies fit within the limits of the financial sums received from shadow participation in the legalization of income of the KGB of the USSR and Cuban special services, which were permitted at that time. In January 1987, Donald Trump received an official invitation to visit the USSR. This was Trump's first trip to Moscow. Earlier, in late 1986, at a dinner party hosted by Leonard Lauder, who ran his mother Estée Lauder's cosmetics empire, Donald Trump met with Yuri Dubinin, then the USSR's ambassador to the UN. According to reliable sources, it was Donald Trump's wife, on the recommendation of her bosses in Prague and their handlers in Moscow, who persuaded Donald Trump to attend the event. Yuri Dubinin, like the vast majority of Soviet diplomats, was a Soviet intelligence officer working under diplomatic cover. From May 1986 to May 1990, he was the USSR's ambassador to the United States. Please note, the dates of Dubinin's transfer to the USA and the time of his work strangely coincide with the preparation for Donald Trump's arrival in Moscow and the monitoring of his actions after the meeting with KGB chairman Chebrikov. But there are no coincidences among intelligence agencies. Dubinin's appointment to the post of the USSR permanent representative to the UN, to the Security Council for a period of 2.5 months, was a cover operation for further actions in the final stage of the operation. And judging by these actions, the leadership of the KGB of the USSR desperately needed a personal meeting with Trump. To officially cover his trip to the USSR in January 1987, Trump received an invitation from the State Committee for Foreign Tourism, which was one of the main mechanisms in the official espionage activities in the KGB of the USSR. By July 1987, his meeting with the chairman of the KGB of the USSR Chebrikov was fully prepared. From my own experience, I know that the preparation of such personal meetings of foreign citizens with the leadership of the USSR intelligence services took at least 6 months. But this meeting was prepared in an accelerated mode. What was the task facing the KGB leadership? With Gorbachev's rise to power in the USSR, a course was set for perestroika, including the normalization of relations with hostile Western countries. To solve such problems, it was necessary to change the face and internal appearance of the system in the eyes of potential Western partners. To achieve their goals, the Chekists always relied on bribery and recruitment of high-ranking officials, but such active measures required completely different amounts of money. This is no longer just shadow support for terrorist organizations, here is a qualitatively different budget. Over the course of 9 years of close cooperation with Donald Trump, the leadership of the KGB of the USSR became convinced of his reliability and finally decided to entrust him with very substantial sums. This explains the fact that in the period from 1987 to the end of 1990, the financial affairs of Donald Trump's companies sharply went uphill. During this time, his capital miraculously increased by $375 million. This was a colossal surge, not seen before. The magic of the genius of a successful businessman dissipates if you understand how the secret springs of the special services work. And 6 official bankruptcies in the following years speak for themselves. In 1989, the political and military alliance uniting the pro-Soviet countries of Eastern Europe completely collapsed. One of the first to cease to exist was the State Security Service of Czechoslovakia. Donald Trump and his companion Ivana Zelnkov saw their chance to get rid of each other and at the same time get out from under the control of their curators from Prague and Moscow. The official reason for their breakup seems naive. Professional intelligence officer Ivana Zelnichkova, with the psychology of an escort acquired during her service, simply could not get jealous of Trump, having caught him with his mistress in the hotel corridor. So this breakup was truly mutually beneficial. By the way, they divorced in March 1992, and it was in this month that the KGB and the first main directorate of the KGB of the USSR ceased to exist. It should be noted that Statny Bezpanost finally disappeared in early 1990, but the KGB controlled its agent until March 1992, monitoring the movement of funds allocated to him. However, since 1990, this grip also began to weaken, especially after the recall of Trump's curator Yuri Dubinin from Washington. This was a lucky chance. And Trump, relying on his criminal psychology, decided to quietly forget about the Lubyanka money. But it didn't help him. The decline of his financial prosperity coincided with the collapse of the USSR, and from the end of 1990 until the end of 1996, his business entered a deep crisis. But it also miraculously ended in 1997, after Donald Trump's second visit to Moscow in 1996 and his personal meeting with the leadership of the FSB of Russia, which inherited the dirt on Donald Trump. Alas, his attempt to jump off was not successful. In post-Soviet Russia, the new leadership of the country and the FSB have new geopolitical tasks. other than schemes for legalizing money received from the production and sale of drugs and bribing officials in the United States and Western countries. And this was already pulling Donald Trump to the electric chair. The new tasks set before Trump by the leadership of the FSB of Russia, in their nature and scale, do not compare with his previous crimes. And I will tell about Trump's active measures under the leadership of his new bosses in the final part of the message. It is time to talk about President Donald Trump and his consequences in the active measures carried out by the FSB of modern Russia. As I have already reported, in March 1992, Trump got off the hook of the KGB of the USSR, as if forgetting about the Soviet money allocated to him as a result of a personal meeting in Moscow with some KGB of the USSR Viktor Chebrikov. After consulting with my reliable specialists from the then leadership of the KGB of the USSR, I am ready to state that the money was intended to pay for services to high-ranking persons in London in US circles and for more effective implementation of active measures in the territory of the USA and other countries of the Western Hemisphere. After the collapse of the USSR and the emergence of the liquidation of the KGB of the USSR and other special services in the countries of the Eastern Agreement, Trump considered that he had been forgotten. But he was disappointed. In early November 1996, at the invitation of the first efficiency of the Prime Minister of the Moscow government, the head of the Complex of Perspective Development Vladimir Rezin, Trump came to Moscow. He arrived accompanied by representatives of the American company U.S. Tobacco, together with which it is planned to build in the elite residential room of Moscow a complex for foreign businessmen. In fact, it was a good bait prepared by the FSB of Russia to restore cooperation and to begin work already with the new leadership of the FSB and SVR. According to my information, control over the implementation of further cooperation with Donald Trump was assigned to the first impact of the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation, Colonel General Aleksandr Shtrbakov. Shtrbakov Alexei Anatolievich worked in the PGU system of the KGB of the USSR since 1964. Graduated from intelligence school. Worked in Belgium, was twice experienced in business trips to India. He went from a junior operative to the first influence of the director of the SVR. During this visit, Trump met with Shtrbakov. But to create closer contact and detailed discussion of further cooperation, Trump returned to once again, in December 1996. For cover, the main goals of the visit were with the first Deputy Prime Minister of the Moscow government Vladimir Rezin. The main topic of discussion was the project of the residential complex Trump Tower. According to my reliable source, Donald Trump and Alexei Shtrbakov spent 2 days in a separate office, specially prepared for these purposes in the building of the Moscow City Hall. At the insistence of the SVR leadership, in order to better cover up such cooperation and Trump's more frequent visits to Moscow, the mayor's office proposed several construction projects. For example, the reconstruction of the Moscow and Russia hotels, the possibility of Trump's participation in the construction of the world's largest children's entertainment center called Miracle Park, on which Moscow Mayor Luzkov's friend, sculptor Zurab Tsereteli, worked. According to American media, Trump offered the sculptor his plan to create a huge, the size of the Statue of Liberty, monument to Christopher Columbus in Manhattan. These projects were widely covered in the Russian and American press. But not a single, even the smallest construction project involving Donald Trump's companies in Moscow was ever implemented. Simply initially, these were just well-prepared cover operations in order to initially be able to remove any suspicion from the U.S. intelligence services regarding such frequent trips and public communication. The Russian intelligence services initially tried to protect their valuable agent during such trips, adding a financial interest to him. One of the manifestations of payment for the services of such cooperation with the SVR was an event held in November 2013. Then Donald Trump organized the Miss Universe Beauty Contest in Moscow, co-owner of which he was from 1996 to 2015 together with the NBC television company. For its holding in the Moscow Crocus City Hall, Trump, according to media reports, received $14 million from the entrepreneur and owner of the Crocus Group Aras Agalarov and other investors. According to the data received from my informant, the lion's share of this money came from the SVR, and possibly from Russian President Vladimir Putin himself. I can assume that Donald Trump knew who the main source of the sum that came to him was. It was decent, considering that Trump once purchased the estate in Mar-a-Lago for $5 million. Or a little more. Trump was increasingly hooked by the Russian special services. The strategic geopolitical tasks that were set before him during the Miss Universe contest in 2013 exceeded all possible fantasies of Vladimir Putin himself. In my opinion, these $14 million were a small advance for future actions on the part of the KGB FSB agent Donald Trump. It was then that he was set with the strategic task of going into politics and trying to take the seat of the US president. Moscow constantly came to the rescue, promptly solving the financial problems of the great businessman during 6 bankruptcies of the companies belonging to him. Former employees of the IA Directorate of the KGB of the USSR surrounded him with their care and help from the moment of their cooperation back in 1978. And I am sure that some of them are still present in his entourage. I see signs of the use of patterns and skills embedded in me, among others, which were used by us, employees of the Soviet Special Services, during active measures. After all, it is impossible to hide the knowledge and skills obtained from common teachers and a special style. I will not focus on the 2016 election campaign and the obvious participation of specialists from the IA Directorate in it, using dirty political technology methods against Hillary Clinton in the interests of Trump. However, I will dwell on the personal meeting of US President Trump with Putin during the Russia-US summit on July 16, 2018 in Helsinki. During a personal conversation with Putin in a face-to-face format, Donald Trump violated the US security law by refusing the mandatory presence of an American interpreter during the conversation in such cases. I emphasize, this is a mandatory procedure established by law. Perhaps Donald Trump had something to hide from his employee. However, it was after this personal meeting that Donald Trump came out to journalists psychologically depressed. And on the contrary, his vis-à-vis Putin demonstrated the elevated mood of a winner and master of the situation. The second point I want to focus on is the staging of an assassination attempt on US presidential candidate Trump. This spectacle took place on July 13, 2024, when a shooting occurred during a campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. I am qualified to discuss this event from a professional point of view, since, as a young junior officer, I received specialized sniper training. Alas, I had to use these skills during short-term deployments to Afghanistan in 1984-86. Therefore, as a professional sniper, I could analyze this entire spectacle in detail. But for now, I will focus your attention on the personality of one young woman who was the only female guard of Donald Trump at that moment. In some of the footage of the assassination attempt, this female security guard is clearly visible. She, who is short in comparison to Trump himself, tries to cover him from the front, from the most dangerous direction of fire. Moreover, she leaves his entire head and even part of his chest open for a subsequent shot. Any professional will tell you that this is an initially incorrect distribution of roles in Trump's security system in the event of such situations. Why did this become possible? Because she was Donald Trump's only personal bodyguard, unlike all the other male guards from the government agency. And I am inclined to assume that she was aware that this assassination attempt was staged. And now directly about Trump's savior. This young woman is Russian. She comes from the small town of Ryazsk in the Ryazan region. In the late 2000s, it was part of the security service of Serebryansky Cement Plant LLC, which is part of the Basel Cement holding. The chairman of the supervisory board and founder of Basic Element is the Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska, a billionaire, head of the merged company Rusal and EN Plus Group. In 2001, the security service of Basic Element was headed by the former head of the Counterintelligence Department and former deputy director of the FSB, Colonel General Valery Pavlovich Pochenkin. Pochenkin himself was born in Donetsk, studied at the higher KGB courses under the USSR Council of Ministers in Minsk, worked first in the KGB Directorate of the Voroshilovgrad region, and then in Kamchatka. He supervised the work of the department for exposing foreign agents. In Voroshilovgrad, Pochenkin had a daughter, Tatyana, who later wanted to get into show business, and her loving father organized this for her. Her career was on the rise, but in 1995 she tragically died in a car accident. Russians know her as Tatyana Snezhina, the author of the song Call Me With You, performed by the star of the Russian stage Alla Pugacheva. This is how intricately intertwined the events in Russia are, where the KGB leaves traces almost everywhere. But let's return to the personality of Valery Pochenkin. In 1981, he was appointed head of the 2nd KGB Directorate, Counterintelligence. From 1991, he headed the Ministry of Security Directorate for the Novosibirsk region. In 1995, he returned to Moscow to the post of head of the FSB Counterintelligence Operations Directorate. In September 1997, he was appointed Deputy Director of the FSB and head of the Counterintelligence Department. On November 22, 1997, he was included in the Interdepartmental Commission for the Protection of State Secrets. They had been closely acquainted with Oleg Deripaska since the 1990s, when Pochenkin headed the Ministry of Security Directorate for the Novosibirsk region and protected the criminal business of Deripaska and his accomplices in the Siberian region. This was a time of criminal wars for the redistribution of property in Siberia, of which Pochenkin was the shadow owner. On July 25, 1998, Yeltsin appointed Vladimir Putin as the director of the FSB, and Pochenkin became one of his most trusted persons in the FSB system. According to my information, he carried out the most important and even bloody orders of his boss. After Putin became president of Russia, their personal relationship only grew stronger. It was Pochenkin who introduced Putin to Deripaska, who eventually became Putin's personal wallet and the main custodian of most of Putin's assets. Pochenkin, on the other hand, remained in the role of the overseer, responsible for the security system of these assets. He was appointed Deputy General Director of Basic Element for Asset Protection in 2009, and in June 2018 he became General Director of the holding company Basic Element. But let's get back to the female security guard from Donald Trump's inner circle. According to the information I have, this woman worked in the security service of the Serebryansky cement plant construction in the city of Mikhailov, which, by the way, is located 99 kilometers from Ryazsk, her hometown. She was a master of several types of martial arts, and Pochenkin himself immediately took a liking to her. He began to entrust her with the execution of important tasks, including the murder of people. Pochenkin had influence and dirt on her, blackmailed her, and threatened to deal with her family. This influence has remained to this day. On the recommendation and protection of Pochenkin, the woman from the city of Ryazsk underwent training and special training at the Ryazan Guards Higher Airborne Command School, improving her previous skills and acquiring new ones, including special training in parachute jumping and proficiency in all types of bladed and firearms. In 2015-16, Pochenkin introduced her to Oleg Deripaska's personal security. She became the oligarch's personal bodyguard, with the same function of carrying out personal and most important assignments. Deripaska took her to the United States. And it was after the meeting between Donald Trump and Putin on July 16, 2018, in Helsinki that this lady strangely found herself in the personal security of the US president. I believe that this transfer was planned in advance and agreed upon by Pochenkin with Putin himself. Oleg Deripaska was just a transmission link in this castling. Thus, Putin and Pochenkin received the most devoted eyes and ears, in close proximity to President Donald Trump. Since then, this lady has been following Trump like a faithful shadow. She was also in Mar-a-Lago, and one can only guess what top-secret documents taken out of the White House she had unhindered access to. I have no doubt that she had enough time to copy and pass on to her master Pochenkin everything that interested the main character, Putin. I am sure that this theft of documents was a pre-planned and well-executed operation of the Kremlin special services. And the very participation of this strange female security guard in the active event with shooting at Trump's ears gives reason to believe that we are dealing with an unprecedented interference of a hostile state in the presidential elections in the USA. I will note that it was this story with the assassination attempt that affected Trump's rating. Consequently, and the outcome of the vote. It is difficult to believe precisely because this story is unprecedented, but it only seems incredible. The current active measures carried out by Donald Trump, Elon Musk and their other associates to destroy the US security community and army, to destroy NATO and break relations with European countries, correspond to the plans of Putin, who wants to weaken the political and military alliance in European countries and ultimately destroy both NATO and the European Union. Putin dreams of restoring the geopolitical influence of the USSR and raves about conquering all of Europe, something Joseph Stalin dreamed of but never achieved. Unfortunately, these goals can be achieved with the help of those active measures, the templates of which I have described. Deep down, I hope to reach the consciousness of European politicians and the heads of European intelligence services who are capable of preventing this madness. We still have some time. But it is catastrophically short. End of communication.